good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of both UOC, UOC, and UNITAR, and welcome to our series of webinars, where we are going to deal with on regards of conflict, peace, and security, which are these thematics that actually we covered in one of our joint programs. And I would like, first of all, thank you for your interest. We hope that we are going to be able to raise a lot of concerns and to see what are the skills of the professionals that are dealing with these fields of expertise. And we are going to try to combine these two aspects, both academic input and as well practical input from our guest speaker, that is Dr. Due-Gundersen. And thank you very much for having joined us. And I want to thank you as well, Marisa and UNITAR, for all your support in organizing this. I will let now the floor to my colleague, Dr. Hans Spotzer, that is our program director of UNITAR, in order for you, if you want to introduce our guest speaker, and then I will also like to shape the debate both with the guest speaker and everyone that has joined this conversation. So thank you very much on behalf of UOC and UNITAR for having joined us this webinar this afternoon, and hope you are going to join.
Thank you so much. My dear and well-respected colleague from the University of Umberto. We are indeed, UNITAR is indeed extremely proud to be introducing you to Dr. Due-Gundersen. But I would like you, the moment is indeed a very proud one, because I wish to remind Dr. Due-Gundersen when he came to Geneva and he came for an admissions interview, and when I was the director of the Geneva School of Diplomacy, and I was immediately struck by the seriousness and focus of Nicolai, Dr. Due-Gundersen, if you allow me, of Nicolai. And Nicola's father kept on answering my questions, and I had to ask his father to please go and have a coffee so that I could have a conversation with Nicolai. And within the first minute of us sitting together, I knew that I had in front of me a very serious scholar in terms of political science, but more so one that had a social conscience when it comes to how we critically reflect today, in that we don't use outdated paradigms and methodologies, but that we have really the need to reflect together and how we can update so many of the practices that within the UN today becomes the modus operandi of how we deliver in terms of high quality impact programs that specifically looks at the generic themes of security, peace, and conflict studies. And I would just also like to say that Dr. Due-Gundersen is highly qualified, well steeped in experience when it comes to specifically the Middle Eastern and African context. So without any further ado, I would like to start this conversation with Nicolai, because the series, and we also together the University of Oberta de Catalunya, UNITAR, and our honored guest, Nicolai, would like to thank you, the participants. We have 75 of you who honor us with your presence, and we would hope to show you and to demonstrate why it is so important today to advance our knowledge, and specifically yours, and how we can help to facilitate that in terms of peace, security, and conflict studies. But I would like to start with everybody is focusing on Syria's Idlib province, and it's always more important that when we have these webinars, that we focus on what are some of those real challenges that we have on the field. And Nicola, if we could please start with, describe to us, what is happening on the field in Idlib, seen through the bifocals of peace, security, and conflict, and what happened there? Why are we seeing this devastation today? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those kind words and a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. With regards to your question, Syria has been now for almost a decade a source of conflict, of regime resistance, and Idlib specifically. One of the reasons it's so important is because it represents the last bastion of resistance towards Bashar al-Assad. And this is very, very important, as we discussed before at GSD, when you look at geopolitics, the symbolism it presents as a bastion of resistance towards Assad. This is why he's so obsessed with gaining or regaining control of the area. Of course, this means we have a huge humanitarian crisis on our hands, as Idlib has represented, up until recently, represented the last area in Syria where people could flee from the east and from places like Aleppo. And we see that this is spreading into the region as well. So Syria it's an ongoing humanitarian conflict. The UN is doing a lot, it's doing what it can to try to alleviate that, but at the end of the day, we need to have the parties that are involved, not just, of course, Assad, but Russia, Turkey. They have to sit down and renegotiate previous agreements and agree to some sort of a ceasefire. This is one of the things we need to, before we can look at actually seriously relieving this humanitarian crisis.
You raise a very important point, and I would like to build a little bit on that, where you say, every action needs to be done. There needs to be more of a coordinated action to averting this humanitarian crisis. So, in terms of security, peace, and conflict, what do you think the role of the United Nations can be or should be in this regard?
Well, again, this is part of the issue, that we're living in an age where I feel that nations are not necessarily as united as they were before. And this is an unfortunate reality. We see, for example, in the case of Syria, we see it's become a proxy war. We see self-interest through different countries. The UN itself is, even as we speak, is actively intervening on humanitarian grounds. It's providing as much as it can in terms of aid, shelter. It can also, through perhaps the Security Council, try to push for an end to this escalation, an end to this violence, and to basically get these political actors to sit down and renegotiate. But again, one of the issues we've seen, especially after the Arab Spring, the nature of warfare has changed. We're now seeing more proxy wars, medium-scale conflicts in which one country ends up hosting several other political actors who have their own interests. And this is also part of the problem, that fragmentation in the nature of conflict, which has changed, I'd say, over the past 10 or 20 years.
Thank you. Let's bring the conversation to so many of the participants that we have online who clearly have an interest in the evolution of and the application of the paradigm of peace, security, and conflict studies. And what would you say? Why should it matter to them today as we speak? And if we look at the evolving issue of governments not being as united in terms of the structures of global governance, which is as we all know, are all the results of the the Second World War and very much Eurocentric, and governments and the challenges today do not represent that anymore. So what would you say, why is it important for the participants today that they do look into following development courses and so on in terms of peace, security and conflict studies? Why is it important for us?
Well, I think, in a sense, we've hit the nail on the head here, which is that we live in a world that needs to be more human. I think that this is really what we've seen with the refugee crisis, and with also the way that certain nations have reacted to the refugee crisis. So understanding peace and conflict development can help you understand why we have some of the structural issues in the world today. So the Second World War, we had refugees in the Second World War. We're now seeing a different nature of your refugee crisis. And I believe that there are many people who have the heart to try to make the world a better place, but they need a structured manner in which to gain the skills. And this is where a program like this can be quite useful. I also believe that, again, with the refugee crisis itself, one of the things that I ask my students when we're going to talk about how to return the world to peace, it's about humanization. Whose crisis are we talking about here? Because to be frank with you, in the West, we see a lot of talk about the crisis being one of resources, that we can't bring people in, we can't afford to do so, when really the crisis should be about humanizing these individuals, humanizing what's happening to them. And I do believe that with peace and conflict studies, this is precisely one of the things you examine. You understand how to humanize the world, how to humanize what's happening right now with current events as well.
Let's thank you very much for that. And you bring up something that is indeed very, very close to the framework of this program that we run in partnership with the University of Oberta de Catalunya and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. And you say it's all about bringing back humanity into so much that we do. But isn't also the fundamental issue of states today about absolute power? And how do you find the right balance? Because we see more and more an increase of populism, the pendulum moving towards the right, extreme right, and the rhetoric that goes around it in terms of those that do not look or speak or behave like us should be feared.
Yes.
What can we as individuals do to change that paradigm?
Well, I think that's also a very important point, because some of what you've just mentioned, the idea of otherness, these people are somehow not of us. This is an attitude that we are seeing an increase of this, especially the rise of the far right, but also it happens subconsciously. So for example, if you've never been to the Middle East and you live in New York or in London, you come home from work, you're tired, you turn on CNN, and there's nothing but bombings in Yemen and Syria. Some people will subconsciously form the opinion that the Middle East is unsafe. Oh, this is normal. We have to attack that and actively resist that kind of mentality. We have to engage with other cultures. And I think that the world has become more and more international. States have become more and more international. And it is possible, I think, in this day and age, therefore, to actually reach out to others, reach out to those from other communities, to understand their perspective, to have more empathy for others as well. I would also add, one of the issues that we've discussed before in research is the fact that the attitude towards other groups is often influenced by whichever government is in power in that country. I mean, for example, now in the UK, we have Brexit, and we've seen a rise of Islamophobia, a rise of xenophobia, and we have seen campaigns that have pushed the idea that somehow immigration is bad, that these people do not belong here, and therefore we should leave the EU. So we have to look at also how governments may respond and influence the way people think. On the other hand, I do believe, especially now with social media, that there can be a greater bottom-up approach of people trying to understand each other. And this is what I did. I mean, after our time at GSD, I decided that with my focus on the Middle East, it would be better to actually go and live there as opposed to just read about it. And I'm very glad I did that, because when you travel the world, you get to meet people from all sorts of cultures. And when you return back home, you will find a world within a world. I came back to London. I've been living here for about 3 years now. I speak Arabic quite fluently, and I speak Arabic in London with people, which I wouldn't have done 10 years ago. So it's opened up a whole new world to me, and that allows me to also understand other cultures within my own. And I think that is key to humanizing what's happening in the world today.
Dr. Due-Gundersen, you remain a true inspiration. Thank you very much for that. I have one last question before I hand you to my dear colleague, Dr. Jamil. Can I please ask you, if we were to fast forward 5 to 10 years from today, and we see the increasing power of social media mediums and how the youth today are losing interest in the institutions of the state and this idea of absolute power, what do you think governments are going to look like in the near to middle future?
Well, I think that some governments will still have a zero-sum game mentality, unfortunately. But I think that governments that embrace youth and embrace social media, we should see governments of inclusion over the next 10 years. This is what I'm hoping will happen. I sincerely hope that what's happening around the world with refugees will provoke not only a rise in the far right, which is a problem, but also the desire to empathize for governments to actually be more inclusive, to ensure that people are not lost out.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I hand you in the good hands of my colleague from the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it was a pleasure to listen to you. I would like to say hello because I see some of our participants just greet everyone. So good afternoon from Mohammed Al-Maroof, who is saying that he's glad to be here, and as well from Nasiru Abdullahi, that he's also greeting. I see we have a lot of participants, and I think it would be great, you know, to open the ideas to have in conversation with. So I will open as well the floor to the participants. But I want to throw a question to debate and to ask you, one thing would be from the academic knowledge and also from practical skills perspective. And the question would be, what we are seeing now with the coronavirus, famous crisis that everyone is seeing. Yeah. And we are seeing now the impact that this could have as well in the Middle East. We just have seen the outbreak in Iran. We are seeing also like now spreading in Lebanon some cases that we're confirming. I want to know the consequences in one hand, taking into account that you're here, if you could try to understand. And then I would actually open the floor to our participants. But I would like to ask you as well, when we are seeing this crisis, this eruption of something that was not unexpected, what are the skills that also could be valuable to match knowledge?
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you.
I think I can't hear you.
Zubeki, can you unmute for one moment and then we open the discussion?
Yep, so if I understood correctly, to discuss the coronavirus within the context of its spread in the Middle East.
Nicola, can I just ask you to hang on one second?
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, those of you that have connected, can I please ask you to mute your microphones because it interferes and we cannot hear. So please, can I ask you as well, your webcams, your cameras. So my brother from the African soil, Nuzobechi, can I please ask you to cut your camera and your sound, and then when we will give you the opportunity to ask your question. Thank you.
So I would say that Nicolai, I don't know, Dr. Bukdu, if you heard, but basically it was two questions really. One is from the point of view, like if you could comment on how this could affect the region.
Yep.
And then the second one is we have participants that probably come from different backgrounds, but we face linking again to this idea that we are everyone in the same humanity and we have different crises, but they all affect us. What are the skills on a professional level, that you think that someone should bear in mind when dealing with this kind of crisis? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for those insightful questions. Well, if I may firstly address the question of the coronavirus in the Middle East. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we now are seeing the coronavirus in Iran, in the United Arab Emirates as well. Flights to Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon have been banned by certain Gulf states. And also, one of my colleagues actually this morning told me that in Kuwait, there was a flight coming from Iran that was told to turn back. So, we're looking at immediate containment. Now, there are several points to the coronavirus and its political effects on the Middle East that I would like to address. Firstly, we will actually see that Saudi Arabia has banned religious visas. There's something in Islam called the Hajj or the Umrah, which basically means the ability to go to Mecca. Now that has been banned because of the coronavirus. And I mention this simply because what we're seeing in this region is we're talking about governments that focus on controlling religion for political gain. So what we might find is if the coronavirus continues and these regimes struggle to contain the virus, it could actually affect their legitimacy in various ways. That's one. Secondly, we may actually see because of that, the Middle East nations start to work together more despite various differences because of this virus. What I'm looking for right now as an expert, I'm looking at, for example, the blockade of Qatar by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf allies. That blockade may actually be reversed because what will happen is they'll say, we need to work together to contain this virus. We need access to each other's experts. There was an emergency meeting on the coronavirus recently. Qatar was not invited, but I do believe that that may be reversed. So we may actually see over time that the coronavirus spreading across the Middle East brings certain governments together in a way that it did not, because they have to be united to fight this outbreak. Of course, information is still ongoing. We don't know yet how bad this virus is, but I would say that that's one aspect that can happen. Unfortunately, going back to Syria and other places, we have to discuss also the prospect of outbreaks in refugee camps or areas with displaced persons. So as we see people fleeing Syria and whatnot, these are people who will not have access to medical care or immediate sanitation areas. If there's an outbreak there, it will be far worse. So that's sort of my prediction of what may happen regarding the coronavirus in the Middle East.
Okay, so thank you very much for that input. Sorry, I know sometimes the problem, but it was interesting to hear. I think, I don't know if my colleague, Dr. John Hans also would agree, but I think it's a good moment trying to maintain this in more personal approach and conversation with. I don't know if any of our participants would like to open the floor to get any. We would be more than welcome you to ask any questions you may have to our guest speaker. So is there anyone from you, Muhammad or Nasiru, that were greeting that have any specific question in regards either to the Middle East, that we were more discussing, or in regards of the skills that professionals in the field of conflict, peace and security, where could they gain from? Where they could develop those skills? Now the floor is open to ask it.
Yes, I mean, if we're going to look at the kind of skills that you would develop over time, I mean, I think certainly an understanding of peace and conflict studies is quite important. That gives you a good base. Certainly, when I was during my time in Switzerland, I felt that I got a solid grounding in that, which allowed me to develop my academic career. Certainly, my master's thesis was transformed into a book, but I think also the further aspect is, I think, cultural engagement in a conflict zone or non-conflict zone is very important. So, for example, if we look at Sudan as one aspect, I was actually in a meeting last week at Parliament where they were talking about Sudan. They were activists. They were talking about the difficulty of implementing peace agreements. And one of the things that we discussed was the notion that when you're going to have external actors who are trying to oversee this agreement, know the culture as best as you can. So in Sudan, don't just speak Arabic, speak Sudanese Arabic. learn which region you're going into and learn that dialect, or send someone who speaks that dialect. So understanding the culture, again, having empathy is very, very important. And I think that peace studies gives you the grounding for that. And from there, you begin to specialize and you begin to look at other cultural specific case studies. Field experience is a must. I mean, this is what I have focused on since my time in Geneva over the past now 7 years or so, basically field experience and trying to understand other cultures from their perspective. That's very, very important.
I would just like to build on that and to say you're absolutely right, and we have seen that, and certainly the approach that UNITAR takes in its capacity building is to celebrate our differences rather than to fear what makes us different. So thank you very much. So I'm going to open the floor, and what I'm going to do is then invite our brother from the African soil, Nuzubechi, to please, I'm going to hand you the microphone, so please feel free to pose your question.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. I saw the opportunity to be in this program or this sort conference, and I had a pressing question. You know, some of the limitations we face here, maybe me and my mates or colleagues, are resources or maybe where to find advice. Like, I'm studying environmental management and toxicology now. Most of us don't know how to use those knowledge, how to implement those knowledge in certain areas where they are needed. So that's why I came to I engaged in this conference to be able to know what are those special skills, or what are those required skills, and how are we going to get access to such skills and such conferences, workshops, and all that.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, what you're talking about in a sense is gaining different skills through your program will happen in several ways. Firstly, I think if I'm correct here, UNITAR as an organization has a variety of academics and professionals as part of their program. And I mention this because what happens there is that you will not just sit in on a class and read books. You will gain knowledge from the person teaching you, including field experience. It's very good to have professors and others who can say to you, for example, when I was in Lebanon, we observed the following. When we looked at negotiating a peace treaty, there was the following. So I think that having a program that gives you access to the right people is important, and it comes on top of the formal structure of the program. From there, of course, once you've graduated, you can look at different ways to get work experience, and this is what I did. I mean, some of this is down to the individual, to the, if you like, the candidate to decide what do you want to do with these skills. You know, it's a launching base, and you take it from there as well.
Thank you so much. And
Yeah,
as you know,
we
also celebrate gender equity at the in our program. So what I'm going to do now is to give the word to Polly Walker. Polly, can you hear us?
Sorry, I'm new to this.
Voilà. Please go ahead.
Hi.
Hi there.
I'm in quite a bright room. I don't know if you can actually see me. So I would just like to ask, going back to right at the beginning when you were talking about the conflict in Syria and how to be able to deal with a situation that is so complex, it would involve a lot more coordination and cooperation because the UN can't do it alone, or obviously there's many, many limits to intervening in a country. So what are the, I don't know if individually or through organizations or that kind of stuff, what can we, or what would be the possibilities in an ideal world to be able to I don't know, solve or
no,
help solve or.
yeah, I think I understand your question. It's well, no, that's I think that's a very fair point. It actually brings up another issue, which is this: you don't have to live in an ideal world to be idealistic and pragmatic at the same time. Now, what I mean by that statement is that ordinary people can push for what's happening in Syria, for what's happening in Yemen. We have access to information in a way that we didn't used to 20 years ago, especially through social media. And what this means is that, as an ordinary person, you can, for example, push your government, push your MP, push others and say, why are we not doing more to help innocent people? I think that bottom-up approach is also quite necessary, because it's a reminder that we're all human. We should care about each other. It's not just the responsibility of one international organization or the state. It's also our responsibility as fellow humans to care. I was having a conversation with a colleague about this, and they were mentioning that, for example, they could write to their local MP about Yemen and about weapons deals between particular government and Saudi Arabia. So there are things you can do to pressure political actors if you feel they are not responding enough. And you may think that you're just one person, but if enough of us do it, we become an ocean.
Mohammed, you have the word.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, good afternoon. My major concern is just more like what Onyebuchi just said, that the other guy from Nigeria, I'm also from Nigeria too. Here, it's more of a problem trying to apply what one has acquired in the school into real life situation. I just finished a master's in peace studies and conflict resolution. Unfortunately, I've been a teacher all the while. And during the course of my teaching, I've always integrated that into my teaching. And of course, we have always had challenges with how people relate here. Issue of conflict has always been a very big issue for us in Nigeria. We have the Boko Haram and what have you not, and intolerance among the various ethnic and religious groups. And so I don't know if there are opportunities for one to just like this kind of forum, get acquainted with people who are doing similar things so that you can always learn from them and sharpen up our skills and knowledge and be able to do better than we are doing at home presently. That's my questions.
Yeah, I think you're building on your colleague's question as well there. So the idea of how can you solidify your skills further and perhaps contribute to your home nation or your home country as well. I think that when you focus on a course like this, you will meet a lot of international people who have their own life experiences and professional experiences, and you end up learning from each other as well. When you have looked at peacekeeping and the studies around it and conflict studies, I think what a lot of my students do is they try to look at how they can apply that to their home countries or their home region. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have stories. And I think that over time, you can build on your masters and develop soft skills. This is certainly what I did, that I decided that, again, the Middle East was going to be my focus, and I went there. Now, I appreciate not everyone has that option, but often you can ask yourself, how can I contribute after I'm done with the masters? What does my contribution, what do I want it to be, and how can I start that? Sometimes there are internships, sometimes it's as simple as launching your own initiative, for example, approaching various venues for that. In my case, one of the things I did was I took my field experience and I pushed to launch a conference at my university called Understanding MENA about the Middle East and North Africa. And so, I did this, I gained experience from it, and I gained connections, but I also created a platform that would allow me to further my skills. And I think that a lot of this is self-initiative that will build on your skills and build on your program, if you like.
Thank you. It's a well-answered question. I'm happy. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to meet you.
Let's go now to, we give the word to Lilian Hofland.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think I can.
Yeah, okay. I was just wondering, apart from English, what language do you think would be more relevant to understand the conflict of the near future?
Yes, apart from English, I think it depends on the region you're looking at, but I would say Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian would be three key languages to look at for a variety of reasons. I mean, we're not just talking about the parties to the conflicts, but also the people. Again, I want to emphasize in a conflict zone, don't just focus on the political actors, focus on the innocent people. Now, if you go into, for example, the Middle East, if you were to try to help in a place like Yemen or Syria, and you want to speak to local people, speaking their language is very useful. There are things in Arabic that only work really in Arabic as opposed to in English, for example. Arabic is actually a much richer language, as I found out, than English is. And so, and I'm sure each language has its own story. So I think that you would look at the specific part of the world that interests you and look at what languages they speak, and then you can take it one step further and ask yourself, what dialect do they speak as well? Related to that, I studied what's called Fusha, or formal standard Arabic. I then spent 4 years in Jordan, and I picked up what I thought was the Jordanian dialect. And as it turns out, it was not the Jordanian dialect, it was the Palestinian dialect, because it turns out that a lot of people in Jordan, of course, they're of Palestinian descent. So that actually is a predominant dialect, more so than Jordanian. So that experience taught me about the culture of Jordan and some of the politics of Jordan as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Tobias Lechner, you have the word. Tobias? Tobias, can you hear us? Okay, let's, Tobias? Okay, let's move on to Torjus Harkins. Can you hear us if we give you the word? Okay. Okay. Let's try Ashita Singh. If we give you the word. Ashita, can you hear us? Okay, we seem to have Ashita, can you hear us? If anybody wants to ask a question, could you just raise your hand and we will give you the microphone. Okay.
I think Mohammed Al-Maruf has a question. So Mohammed, if you want to go ahead, just go ahead.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? The presenter with his very rich experience about the Middle East. It's one conflict that I have also followed so keenly. And one thing that have always given me concern is that why is it that the conflicts in the Middle East seem intractable, especially the one between the Palestinians and the Israelites? Because I have looked at several efforts at settling the two country and having two independent country, and it has been so difficult to do. Why do you think it has been that difficult? Is it that there are insincerity on the part of the mediators, or is it that the people have just proven so difficult to want to give in to each other and agree to a settlement? That's my question.
Yes, I mean, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, if you want to call it that, is one that, of course, has been going on for a while now. Again, there have been steps that were taken such as the Oslo Accords and whatnot, but it also depends on which governments are in power and also which governments are trying to use this conflict for their own benefit. So we have seen, for example, in Israel, there's been a swing more to the right, where there's been less interest in having a solution. On the other hand, we've also seen that some of the states in the Middle East are opening up a bit more to Israel for their own reasons as well. So unfortunately, we see a situation in which this issue has become another source of political manipulation for some actors. I think that is also part of it. I have not focused on Israel-Palestine per se. I did not get a chance to go to Israel or to Palestine, but I have been to, and I lived in Jordan, where again, there are a lot of Palestinians. So there's a question of where do they feel that they belong? If they have a Jordanian passport, but are of Palestinian descent, how do they feel as well? And I think that's another thing. The Middle East is not homogenous. We have several different cultures. We have, for example, we have Israel, we have Turkey, we have the Arab world, and then within the Arab world, we have different regions. We have the Gulf, we have North Africa. So we have different identities. For Israel, Palestine, we just have to wait and see what happens. I know that some have argued that the problem is settlements have been done in such a way that they fragment claims to Palestinian territory. And then, of course, Palestinians may also say that they feel that there's no point coming to the table if they cannot get all their land back. I think that's how many Palestinians would feel. But it is the perennial question of the Middle East. I do not believe that if this conflict were over tomorrow, that everything in the Middle East would be resolved. Certainly not after the Arab Spring. And so we have to bear in mind there are also actors who will bandwagon onto this conflict for their own purposes as well.
Can I just, my colleagues, Dr. Ashmil and Dr. Due-Gundersen, I see that we have around 12 minutes left. So let's take one more question and then we wrap it up.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I just want to answer something that has been said.
Hello?
Rafa, he asks, we are recording this session, so we are going to be able to forward you in case you want to follow the conversation and the video, then you can check it out afterwards. So this is going to be offered to participants. So that was just John Hams answering one of the questions that we had. And I would say, and I would agree, that if you want to raise your hand, I think that Pauline also wants to ask something again. Just try to sum it up and wrap it up, and then both to our guest speakers, if you have any general also question in regards to education or specific programs on the field that you want to ask to one of the two institutions co-hosting this event, just please go ahead. And I see that Pauline has a question, and I don't know if somebody else wants to add a final question. Now this is the time. So go ahead, Pauline. Thank you.
I just wanted to build a bit more on my previous colleague's question on the conflict in the Middle East. And again, at the beginning, we were talking about how the possibility of coronavirus actually uniting governments in the Middle East to have a joint action against something. My question is, do you think that that's what the Middle East needs, like something that is potentially really catastrophic to unite them, or would there be a possibility of finding something else in common that would then help maybe mediate a solution?
Well, I mean, obviously, we certainly don't want the coronavirus to get any worse than it already has. It's not a question of morality, it's a question of pragmatics. And I think that this is part of the problem that, especially from my time in the Gulf, there's a lot of self-interest for various countries. And this is why I am skeptical that they would be united for moral reasons. I have seen, for example, the manipulation of religion, which is very separate from how religion is practiced on an everyday basis, how regimes use that. One of the exceptions from my time in the Middle East would actually be Oman, which is a country that has tried to be as neutral as possible and as open as possible to all of its neighbors. It's friendly with the US, it's friendly with the UK, it's friendly with Iran. And this is important because in the 60s, there was a civil war in Oman. The Shah of Iran provided troops. After the Shah was overthrown, Oman still maintained good relations with the Iranian Republic. And they did that because they tried to be as open as possible. This is, in my opinion, a manner of self-interest as well, but most states are not necessarily like that. So you will find, especially now, if you go to the Gulf, I'm going actually, I think I mentioned I'm going in 2 weeks, you will find that there is fragmentation among these states, especially after the Qatar blockade. I don't see that ending anytime soon because of the complexities behind that blockade and behind how each society functions, and also how they may use oil wealth not just to placate their populaces, but also to interfere in Libya or interfere in Yemen as well. So it really, unfortunately, comes down to self-interest.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And then, Nicolai, I'm going to pose the question to you, and this is the last question that comes from Isabel. And Isabel was saying, I was wondering how much responsibility of the conflicts should fall on the hands of international organizations and non-state actors, considering interventionisms that start or fuels conflicts mostly comes from other state actors and proxy powers.
Yes, a very interesting point. And it's also, there's a certain unfairness there, as in, if states start conflicts, then why do non-state organizations have to get involved? Really, the states are the ones who should, but they are the originators in many cases of the conflict. We've seen a lot of intervention by states that has been political as opposed to humanitarian, which is separate from NGOs and non-state actors. I think that's also a fair point. You do need international organizations for a variety of reasons. I think the idea, for example, the UN was started for this reason, you know, to unite nations, to allow us to have nations that are willing to work together. It may not always be a perfect world, but I do believe that international organizations have an important role to play for that reason, because states who start conflicts will not necessarily be willing to back down unless they find that there is interest in it. And this is why when you have non-state actors or organizations, they can act as neutral mediators, which is very important. So we do need them to play that role.
Thank you so much, Dr. Due-Gundersen. And as we say, alhamdulillah, to you for having
Alhamdulillah.
Taking the time this afternoon to join us and to share some of your experience with us. I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Rajmil, but I would just like also to express a most sincere appreciation to each of the participants who took time out in your busy schedules to hear what we have on offer, and also to hear from the wisdom of Nicolai. And I would just like to, again, use the example of, because the recurring question was, how can I become more influential? What can I do with my skills? And I would like to use Nicolai as a role model, because as he repeatedly said, he came to Geneva and said, he's not Swiss, he came to Geneva and said, I would like to study on this program, and I want to do something. And he then invested the time and the resources, the human resources, the intellectual resources, to go and to learn about other people, other cultures, other respects. And now those are effective tools in which he uses it now to be able to, in a very effective way, make him, that's all part of his professional capital that belongs to him. And this is where I would like to say to you as well, is that don't let anybody else indicate to you the greatness that you are as individuals. Yes. You all have it in you, and develop it. You know, it's like a flower, it's like a beautiful tree. Feed it, look after it, and it will blossom into something that is magnificent and amazing. Dr. Rashmil, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much as well, Nicolai. Thank you, John Hans, for concluding remarks. I conclude now with the question of Nasikur that he's asking about different resuming conflicts in Africa. And I talk now on behalf of the director of this program that we are offering with both UNITAR and UOC, Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, where we have different subjects where we deal with conflict regions and conflict as Africa, for example, Middle East, and other hotspots, if you want to call it in that way, that currently nowadays are very important to understand, and where you have to have different knowledge and different skills to try to apply conflict resolution strategies or conflict transformation strategies. So having said that, to conclude, I would like also on behalf of Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, thank you very much everyone for having joined us. And yeah, in case that you have also as well interest, we pretend from our joint program that is Mastering Conflict, Peace and Security Studies that we offer together with UNITAR. We launch different series of webinars where we both try to combine both this academic knowledge and professional skills-oriented webinars where you can gain input from different experts. And in case you have further questions on regards of the content, like now, for example, I'm seeing that Nasuhiro or Nisuechi are asking specifics about the role of environment or Africa, please feel free to contact us. If you want to join us in the program, you're more than welcome, or we can assist you on further developing any specific topic. So on behalf of UOC, I would like to thank you everyone, as well Dr. Due-Gundersen, and thank you as well Mauiza from UNITAR, from also all the logistics and Katrina and all the people behind. And that's all I will complete here. John Hans and Dr. Gundersen. And thank you very much everyone for having joined us this time, and wishing you a very good and pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.